first of all, in terms of me, as Henry said, my name's Charles McIntyre, and I was one of the co-founders of IBIS Capital. And it's a business that I set up about 10 years ago to focus predominantly on the media sector and really from an approach of using knowledge as the key driver to the work that we do, whether that be investing in companies or whether that be in advising companies. So at the heart of everything we do, we think knowledge is a vital factor. And turning to kind of the whole e-learning world, then that came very much to play in this arena. And we've now spent quite a lot of time and doing quite a lot of research into understanding kind of what's happening in this sector. And particularly today is to look at it from a European perspective. We've spent time in the US to understand what's happening there. And today is really looking at the agenda in Europe and to see what can be done in terms of bringing the community together in terms of investors, innovators, and the strategic players. So moving into today, where I wanted to start was to really reference back to an Austrian economist who I'm sure many of you have come across, called Joseph Schumpeter. And Joseph Schumpeter was famous really for his work that he did on business cycles and the impact of innovation. And what he was fascinated by was what he called creative destruction, how systems moved on from one order to the next, and the role of the entrepreneur within that. And that wasn't necessarily just with small companies, that was also about innovation that came from big companies as well. So what we see in terms of e-learning and the education market and training market is really a change in the status quo that currently exists. And what we want to explore is, as that paradigm shift occurs, is trying to see what are the levers, what are the business models, and what are the direction that this industry is going to take, and to understand that really from a business perspective. Joseph Schumpeter himself was a pretty interesting fellow. He set himself three goals in life, personal goals, and those were, first of all, to be the greatest economist in the world. The second was to be the best horseman in all of Austria, and the last one was to be the greatest lover in all of Vienna. People asked him whether he succeeded in achieving all three, and his response was that never to be put completely on the spot, but he said there were many fine horsemen in Austria. So I guess the first part about the whole kind of e-learning response to the paradigm shift is really understanding what the challenge is. And a few months ago in March, I picked up an article which had an interesting observation, which I think has been reported elsewhere, which was the fact that if we were to accommodate all of the children who wanted to enroll in universities by 2025, we would have to build 30,000 student universities per week, four new 30,000 student universities per week to accommodate all of those children. Now, obviously, the point which is being made is the fact that we have a challenge as how to educate and train people, whether it be in the academic environment or whether it be in the corporate training market. And what we're looking about is how innovation comes to this market and how it will affect it. So what you'll hear during the course of today is the different parts of the industry, both small and big, and how they impact on this change. I think the other thing to take into account is really trying to understand kind of what education and training, what the challenges associated with that. And this is a slide that I think really sums up, in my view, kind of the issues that surround trying to teach and train people. And it ultimately comes down to the fact that we aim to try and produce a ubiquitous result for everybody. And as you can see in the cartoon, we've got the monkey through to the fish and the seal, and the teacher is asking that everybody be assessed on a same basis, and the exam be that they climb the tree. Now, what that points to, I think, is a whole series of facts that come into play when we look at education. One is obviously different abilities, different learning speeds, different ways of teaching. You look at the cartoon and it's all taking place in one environment. And so I think when you look at the kind of whole ecosystem, what you have here is really the kind of simple issue that we have to address. There is a better way of using technology to be able to tackle the fundamental problem that we're all different and we all learn in different ways. Oops, sorry. So what I think the thing I would like to turn to next is really kind of why is e-learning so compelling? And what you have at the heart of e-learning is the fact that you've got a direct-to-consumer response that's happening at the moment. So we have very much reported the rise of the MOOCs. And the MOOCs, I think, are a very important role to play. People look at them with fear at some ends of the market in terms of what they might do to content and how they might affect the existing order in terms of the business models. But I think one of the key things that we all need to accept is the fact that what the MOOCs do is that they bring alive the whole concept of e-learning. And they bring it alive to a lot of people, and they effectively bring and suck in an audience into the whole possibility of e-learning. They also, what it does is it empowers the individual so that they know what the possibilities are. And that power is important because it has power to affect the way that institutions teach, the way that governments respond, and how businesses react. And I think at the core of it is probably best summed up by one of the testimonials that was made for the Khan Academy site by this guy here. So let me just see if this will play.
I wouldn't have been able to get the type of help that I got from the Khan Academy really anywhere else. There are some Khan Academy videos that I probably listened to the same concept over 20 or 30 times. And there is no tutor in the world I could have paid to have sat next to me and repeated the same thing over 20 or 30 times without at least them getting a little bit judgmental, or at least them thinking like, oh, well, this guy really is never going to get this concept and he should just give up.
So what comes across loud and clear, and I'm a parent of children as well, is the fact that, and from my own learning experience, is that at a very simple level, you've got something like Khan Academy with video tutorials, which what we need to recognize that this is version 1.0, and the individual here is being able to use that video tutorial in a very simple way, just really the ability to play it back and back again and again and again until they learn a concept. And if we think of this as just the kind of emotive response from that version 1.0, what it tells us is what the opportunity that really lies ahead for the whole possibilities of e-learning. So as MOOCs are a kind of a key part of the kind of media response in the market, I thought one of the things that we ought to look at is kind of what's happening in that space. And more importantly, really for us, is trying to understand the kind of business models that could potentially emerge out of this environment. And so, you know, some of the, I haven't named them all, but just to give a flavor, obviously there's a mention of Khan Academy, and, you know, Khan Academy throws out some pretty amazing statistics in terms of the amount of videos that's downloaded, number of uniques, monthly uniques it's experiencing at the moment, 5.5 million. And then you have businesses like Coursera, who in the space of 1 year have managed to build up 3.2 million registered users. And then there are other businesses. There's a business based out of Ireland called Allison, and then in the US, a business that's focused much more on the corporate training market in terms of lynda.com. Now, what, first of all, I think is that in those choice of four businesses, what you see is four different business models that occur. You've got, obviously, Khan Academy, which depends on donation. You've got Coursera, which has started off free, but is now looking at ways to monetize its position. And, they vary in terms of approaches, but one of the add-ons it's looking at is how to put in certification and assessment into the process and charge people for that. And then Allison is a business that is using advertising to drive its model. And then lynda.com, which is one that is based purely on subscription. So we have a range of models. The issue is then kind of where do we think the world is going to emerge out of this? And I think the key part to it is the fact that there is a product and service for different parts of the market. And there are going to be many different models. The fact that we, as I mentioned earlier, have got MOOCs that are providing free content, we think that is the entry point into the market, and there are going to always be a range of premium products. The education agenda is so important around the world for life outcomes that there will always be a need for premium product over and above whatever free content is out there. The other thing that is important is really the universality of what the e-learning delivers. And just looking at the Coursera split up of its audience, what's interesting is that the United States only represents 28% of its user base. And that, I think, is very telling in terms of where the opportunity is, and also from a European perspective, the importance of building an industry here in Europe so that it can reflect and develop the knowledge and entrepreneurialism that we have in this part of the world, so that it isn't driven out of other economies. The other thing which I think is worth noting is that we'll come on to looking about investment, but you take something like lynda.com, which is the business that is the subscription-based model, and that has earlier this year raised about just over $100 million of funding out of the investment community, which was the first single largest investment in the venture capital private equity environment into a business in this space. Now that is both an important milestone, but also I think it's important to recognize that $100 million, although that seems a big figure, in the scheme of other industry sectors, the fact that that's the largest investment that's occurred to date is also quite a surprising fact, and it shows that there is a long way still to go. So what is the e-learning shift? Why is the e-learning shift so important? Well, first of all, it's about improving life outcomes. The investment that people are prepared to put into education is so important in terms of their careers, their jobs, and their social standing, that it means that money will always be invested in this arena. Second thing is the shift is important because the existing system that we have in terms of education can't deliver the results. First of all, as we saw earlier, in terms of the physical infrastructure, and two, because it's evidently supported now the fact that the more money that's thrown into the existing system doesn't produce better results. And so the consequence is that we need innovation to be able to improve results. Thirdly, skills are an important part of the economies, and we need to make sure that we have skills in the workforce to be able to drive the economic agendas of different nation states, and from a European perspective in terms of ensuring that we have a competitive advantage in terms of our skills within the actual labour force. Fourthly, there is currently a big mismatch in a lot of parts of the market between skills and jobs. And in this area, what you find is two things. One is the current mismatch, so that in the UK, for example, last year, there were, in the business services sector, supposedly 26,900 jobs for which that were available in the market, which there weren't skills to actually be able to fill that part of the market. The other point is the way that the market changes, and in terms of flexibility and the changing nature of the workplace, the IDC projected that within 10 years' time, 60% of the jobs that then would be available have not yet been invented today. So the other key part is ensuring that there is flexibility in the workforce, and e-learning provides that capability. And the other point is that about competitive advantage. Developed nations have used education and training as a key element to preserving their position in the market. And if you look at what's happening elsewhere in the world, then education standards are rising quickly in other parts. And that in turn means that we need to use innovation to improve outcomes. And lastly, the other key bit is the fact that education within the context of e-learning is that we can create a better return on education, both in terms of being able to measure that, but being able to analyze where we get most bang for your buck in terms of systems and structures for education. So what are the barriers that we find to the innovation in the edtech sector? And I say barriers because education as a whole and training seems to me to be one of the most under-innovated areas in the marketplace. And that is strange because it's so important to all of us, kind of the outcomes of that education and training. So there must be a series of barriers that we need to understand. And I think the key bit is really by looking at where the money is in the marketplace. And as far as we can see, the way to look at that is it breaks down to three key areas, both government, student, parent, and then the corporates in terms of the corporate market. Now, the key bit about government is that it's not the end user of the actual product. And so they're buying on behalf of students, but they're doing that in order to be able to push the education system in the market. Now that means that their ability to innovate and respond to market change is going to be slow because they're not the direct consumer. Now, going back to the point about the MOOCs, I think what's interesting is that in that market and the fact that business models similar to that is giving power to the individual, which puts pressure back on government. So that the more that it's talked about, the more that students turn up being able to tell teachers that they've been able to access content in other ways, in other formats, it puts pressure. Secondly, I think there's the student parent in terms of kind of money, and here I think there's quite an interesting difference culturally between different markets. So in the States, I think there is more propensity for parents to spend directly on formats and content and training for pupils than in other parts of the world. And where I'm particularly referencing is obviously Europe, and where there is in certain parts of Europe an expectation that education should be free and state provided, and therefore the notion of additional parent-student support means that the spending is limited. And then the other area is corporates, and what's evident in that part is that these corporate spend is twofold in terms of facts. One is that in Europe we tend not to use very much in terms of e-learning. We tend to focus on using training, direct training. Second bit is that it seems very correlated to the economic cycle. So as we go through tougher times, then corporates tend to cut back on their spending in this space. So what that innovation affects on innovation is that it means it's difficult to extract money out of the system. And we'll come back to some of the business models and how that links into what they're trying to do. The other part which is worth looking at is the point about investment. And there is a big difference between the amount of investment that's occurring in Europe compared to the amount of investment that's being made in the US, by example, in the area of e-learning and edtech. Just evidentially, it appears that both the amount of investment but also the size of investment. So, our research suggests that the size of investment is about 8 times as large in terms of the amount of any individual investment in companies compared to what's happening in Europe. So we're missing money going into investing in innovative businesses, and also the end users are slowly, but importantly slowly, responding, but it's taking time, and that's what's holding back some of this innovation. And then the last point is that I don't think we really have clear leadership in the market. And what I mean by that is that in the context of both government is very gingerly kind of approaching this whole arena, and so there's no clear leadership there. In a corporate environment, there is no kind of standout players in terms of looking at it from a European context of kind of what's been doing. There is a whole issue about larger corporates in terms of digital migration, but in terms of really pushing the innovative agenda, that is still slow to happen. And if you look at elsewhere in the world, you see there are places where there is strong and bold leadership. And one example is Korea. And in Korea, what you see is that they've got a stated intent to make every school completely digitized, both in terms of the infrastructure and content, by 2015. And that is a very clear direction that they're trying to put in terms of push on the market. And we're not seeing that type of approach in Europe. So I thought, just to back up some of those comments, we just flick through some of the numbers. Most of this is extracted from the report that we have done, which is on the USB stick that you have. So obviously research it at leisure when you have access to it later. But just in terms of, from a global perspective, I think the key points really is, in terms of total educational spend, then it's a very big market in total. And the two key areas of the world that are interesting, obviously, at the moment are North America and Europe, and the fact that within that, K-12 represents the largest spend. In the corporate space, interestingly, the spend in terms of corporate learning is very similar between Europe and North America. The market sizes are not too far apart in terms of from a GDP perspective, although in Europe actually there are more workers than in North America, but the actual spend is similar. The fact that we'll come on to in a moment is really where that translates into the e-learning market, where we see a big difference between what's happening in the corporate space in terms of the spend compared to between Europe and North America. In terms of where we see the market going, then the projections that we first started putting out at the beginning of this year, not unsurprisingly, we see an optimistic and healthy opportunity for the market in terms of where it's going, both because of the innovation and also because of the substitution as people move from existing forms of educational spend into the e-learning market. But we see overall a 23% annual growth to be expected across the market. But within that, probably the K-12 market seeing the largest growth, and the corporate education market actually not growing at the same rate. And we'll come on to some of the factors behind that. What I think is key and links into perhaps some of the growth is where investment is occurring. And what is fascinating is the difference between the academic market and the corporate market. And at the moment, there is a huge uptick in direct investment into e-learning in the academic space, as compared to in the corporate market, which is in the graph below, which has actually been falling in recent times. And that, I think, reflects several things. One is obviously the opportunity and innovation that's occurring and the size of the market in the academic space. And secondly, in the corporate space, what we're seeing is, as I mentioned, a correlation between what's happening in terms of the economic cycle. That is interesting insofar as that as you look out at kind of different businesses, there is obviously a big focus on the academic space. Now, I mentioned earlier going back to the corporate space and also looking at where the combined spend of that and education in e-learning between Europe and the US. Now, the overall training markets between Europe and US, as we talked about earlier, were roughly the same. The GDP is roughly the same. But what we're seeing is a huge difference at the moment between the spend on e-learning in Europe versus what's happening in the US. And just figures, roughly about 8 billion in Europe versus about 56 in the US. Now, that's a huge differential, which doesn't reflect the underlying economies. Now, the factors for that are both because of the stage and nascency of what's happening in Europe in that space, but also the fact that there is much more of an impetus and investment that's going on in the US. So I think there is a big lesson for us to learn in terms of the fact that we are somewhat behind what's happening elsewhere in the market. Turning back to education, one of the key issues about education is, as we talked about, the increasing spend that's happening in this market. And over the last 10 years in Europe, it's gone up about 30%. But at the heart of it, one of the biggest items is actually the expenditure on staff remuneration, which represents about 70%. Now, that is important because in the context of e-learning, one of the big issues is the shift of that expenditure and when will that expenditure start to move into some of the potential that e-learning can deliver. And that is a very political issue because that means being able to reduce staffing and being able to use new models of teaching and training. And if you go back to the fact that government obviously is the biggest purchaser and the impact back into the labour force, then there is a balancing act that's going to have to be done in terms of driving the e-learning agenda to produce efficiency and better outcomes in the context of some of the major cost items that exist in e-learning in the education space. So if we turn briefly then to why, from an expenditure perspective, it's important, then this shows outcomes versus what's being actually spent by individual countries on students. So in the US, they're spending the most per student on educating in the secondary education, so $12,500 per student. And the result is on the right-hand side where you'll see that in the context of the USA, they rank somewhat behind places like China, Korea, and Finland in the context of math scores. So the correlation between spend and result as it relates to maths is not there, and part of that has to be to do the way that teaching is delivered. And so as we move into more efficient and more measurable ways of teaching, then these balances between, or links between spend and results can be more effectively measured and driven. So now I want to just give you a flavour of why, from a content perspective, I think e-learning is fascinating. And this links in a bit later in terms of when Benjamin speaks about kind of what's happening in the media space. But e-learning in the context of new formats of learning is not just about the digitization of existing content, it's about creating new ways of teaching, new formats and new forms of content. And I just wanted to give you an example of something that has come out of Denmark that relates to an area of learning and training which in normal world can be quite expensive to be delivered, but you can see this can be done in a very different way. Oops, sorry. So I mean, this is a young company and it's developing these types of content. What it's able to do is to set up virtual laboratories for providing training for lab tests, for DNA sequencing, for a whole range of experimental work. And the advantage is that they can obviously control that whole environment, but the students find it incredibly engaging to be part of that exercise. And so what you deliver is both engaging content, immersive content, and with ability to measure what's actually happening, and also from a delivery perspective, do it at a fraction of the cost of providing a real-world laboratory. Now, it's not that these type of environments can replace everything that happens in the real world, but if you combine some of this with what occurs in terms of the physical world, then you end up with a much more interesting combination of learning and training, which, from our perspective, is where the future will be. So, turning back to the structure of education and training, and particularly as it relates to the e-learning market, we see that falling into kind of four particular sections. One is, which we just talked about, is content, and that what we're looking at is how to create new forms of content which are interactive, dynamic, and can engage people and have a level of personalization. And through today, you'll hear from people very much involved in some of the front end of this. The second bit is really the kind of administration and resource, and both from managing a school, a training center, and but whether it be in a corporate environment or in an academic environment, and looking at that whole process and how that can be improved in the e-learning context. And the big change really that's come along is the ability to use SaaS and cloud solutions to create an environment where we can roll out in terms of scale and also deliver solutions which really change the way that the day-to-day running and issues that people have in terms of managing resource in education and training can be done. And we'll hear some examples of some companies involved in that. And then there is the distribution side. And on the distribution, we're talking about really what e-learning can do in terms of teaching anywhere at any time. And that is very relevant in terms of the technology from an infrastructure perspective that we have in the market. So particularly with the wide penetration of mobile, smartphones, tablets, then what we can see is the fact that we can reach people in different ways, in different places, and they can learn at their own pace and when it's convenient to them. So distribution is another big factor. And then when you link in on top of those systems, the fact that we can then measure in a way that we couldn't before, then the analytics that comes out of an e-learning type structure is something that is incredibly powerful. It allows us, particularly as the networks of these systems get bigger, to be able to monitor progress in a way not done before, both at the individual level, teacher level, trainer level, school level, etc. Now, that monitoring is something that can help reinforce the content, the way that we teach. It can also test out different methodologies in terms of how we like to learn and what's more effective, and use that data to come back into the system. It can also help personalize content as well. So it's a virtuous loop or virtuous circle in terms of what can be done in this space. And from our perspective, getting these parts of the kind of the equation right in terms of the businesses in e-learning is what's at the heart of trying to find the right businesses to back. So thinking about those different models, the other key bit is trying to understand where we are in the hype cycle. And this is a concept that was first developed by Gartner in terms of spread. We start off with the technology triggers, and then we have the peak of inflated expectations falling through to the trough of disillusionment, and then hopefully we return to the slope of enlightenment. And what we notice, obviously, is in terms of trying to work out where businesses are in this environment, is obviously key to understanding the businesses to back, the businesses that are correctly valued for the potential they can deliver. And so on the left-hand side, as we are at the peak of inflated expectations, then certainly the MOOC environment, from our perspective, fits into that. But there are other areas like gamification and adaptive learning, which people are talking about, and I think there's a huge expectation that's building behind some of these concepts. I'm afraid to say that there will be times of disillusionment that are ahead for some of these areas. But there are businesses that are emerging out of that, and what's interesting is that within that kind of type of concept, what you can see is things like social media, social publishing, and so self-publishing, and particularly things that link into SaaS tools for administration, etc., are now, I think, through the trough and starting to be businesses that we can focus on. So what I wanted to bring it back to is some very simple things, because at the heart of it, although we look at kind of where the cycle is, what we really need to understand are what are the problems of today. And there was a survey of all of the Euro 27 countries looking at it at the kind of school environment and trying to understand what has happened over time in those areas. And what stands out is that ICT, in terms of information computer technology, within those environments has improved dramatically. But it's still the biggest issue that is holding back development in schools and training. Second thing is, what do they use these systems for at the moment? And overwhelmingly, teachers use these things for preparing lessons, putting together lesson plans. So one of the takeouts is just there are some very practical, simple things that need to be solved, and those are where perhaps focusing on businesses that can deliver those today and not focusing too much of the jam to tomorrow before it's actually required. So what needs to be done? We need to learn from other industries, and that's where Benjamin will be talking from, particularly as it relates to things like digitization of media businesses and what they experienced and what happened. We need to create a healthy ecosystem. That means making sure all the components within the e-learning environment are there. Funding, support from government, corporate leadership. We need governments to actually encourage, take initiatives, be bold within the e-learning marketplace. We need to provide leadership both in terms of forums like this, but also from businesses in terms of trying to set out an agenda of what can be achieved and what the roadmaps are. And on that basis, I think what's going to be really important today is just to be able to take from what you hear from different people, the synthesis of the different parts of the e-learning system, and to be able to focus on looking where we can build this industry, because it's an industry that's going to occur. It's going to be slower in a lot of areas than people expected, because the spend in the market comes from difficult areas, for example, in terms of schools and government, and those are slow burn opportunities. There is the viral opportunities in direct-to-consumer, and we see those in terms of things like MOOCs. But overall, there is an industry that here is developing, and we very much want to be part of it, and today is about making sure that everybody contributes and is able to find something, whether it be from networking, from understanding a bit more about what's happening, or finding some of the young entrepreneurial businesses that are going to shake up the world that's coming. So thank you very much, and now I'd like to hand over to Benjamin, who'll tell you about his experience within the media industry and how that relates to what's going on in the e-learning sector. So thank you.